Today's lesson, we're going to talk about how to add and subtract rationals with common denominators. In the next class, we're going to talk about how to add and subtract with uncommon denominators. So just kind of reminding us of how we add fractions in general. We need a common denominator. So when we add, we keep the denominator, and then we add the numerator. So we have 4 plus 14 gives us 18, and then we can reduce this to 3. Okay. So at the end, once we have a numerator over denominator, we can reduce. But the key part here is this common denominator, and then we have to add those numerators. So for this one, if we're subtracting, we have 3 minus 21, which gives us negative 18 over 8. And then, so we're keeping the denominator, but now we're reducing. So if I divide by 2, I get 4 and 9, so I get negative 9 fourths. So going through this, making sure you have a common denominator, we want to add or subtract the numerators. So for this particular problem, we have a common denominator, but the denominator is x plus 7. Again, I always like putting parentheses around these just so we know that they come together. This x plus 7 is a pair. So if we subtract the numerators, we have x squared minus 49. And we keep the single denominator, the common denominator. And now we can look to reduce in the same way we reduce the numbers. So we have a difference of 2 squares that we can factor. And then we can reduce. So we're left with x minus 7 is our difference. Okay, let's look at the next one. All right, so now for this one, notice how we have a common denominator again, but this time it's a monomial. So if we have x plus 4 minus x minus 4, this is a binomial. So we need to make sure that we are distributing the negative. When subtracting. This is something that your teachers have been saying again and again, so make sure that when you're subtracting, it's always important to put parentheses around those binomials or trinomials so you know that you have to distribute that negative to all of those pieces. So for this one, our numerator is x plus 4 minus x plus 4 over 4x. But when we simplify our numerator, we're left with 8 over 4x. And now we can reduce. 4 goes into 8 twice, so we're left with 2 over x. So for the second one, again, we have this common denominator, this x minus 1, but now we have this 6x plus 3 after the subtraction sign. So when we see subtraction, we have to think to distribute. So when we distribute this negative, our numerator becomes 5x squared plus 4x minus 6x minus 3. So I'm going to go ahead and simplify. Put that over x minus 1. Okay. So we have to look to make sure that this numerator cannot factor. So a way for us to know whether or not it can factor, we can say, all right, what is 5 times 3? That's 15. Are there factors of 15 that add up to negative 2? So we have 3 and 5. So if we keep going with this, we may have a factor, a common factor that we can reduce, this x minus 1. But if we have 5x and then 5x and then x, and then we have a 1 here. So if we multiply our outer terms, we get 5x, and we want to have a negative 5x and then add 3x to it. Notice how we do get another x minus 1. So we may have to factor in order to continue to reduce. All right, so for this one, we have a trinomial, x squared plus x minus 6 is our denominator, and notice it's the same in both, so we're all good. We're adding, so let's combine our numerators. So we have 2x minus 3x, so we got negative x, and then negative 6 plus 3 gives us negative 3. And then notice our denominator. Can we factor that denominator? And then in our numerator, if we factored out a negative 1, let's see what we get. So we can get rid of those x plus 3's and be left with negative 1 over x minus 2. So making sure that we can factor everything at the end, because now when we have a single fraction, numerator over denominator, we can simplify. Okay, last two. Let's look at these two. And I want us to look at both of these first, and I want you to tell me whether or not the denominators are the same. So we have, for this first one, we have x minus 1 and then 1 minus x. And then for the next one, we have 3 plus y and then y plus 3. These are the same. These are a common denominator, so right away we can just add 9 plus the 1 to give us 10 plus y over 3 plus y, or y plus 3. Either way works. And easily there we can add. But then when it comes back to this first one, remember when we reduced before, we said that x minus 1 over 1 minus x reduces to negative 1. So we have to keep that in mind. And these are not the same, they're opposites. But what would happen if I factored out a negative 1 from 1 minus x? If I factored out a negative 1, I'd be left making this one a negative 1, and then this positive x there. So it'd be negative 1 times x minus 1. So if this second fraction is 4 over negative 1 times x minus 1, can't we move this negative 1 to that numerator? So in our previous lesson, we talked about how we can move that negative from the numerator to the denominator. So we can move that there. So we can actually rewrite this problem as 2x minus 6 over x minus 1 minus negative 4 over x minus 1. And when you're subtracting a negative, this turns into plus. So here we have 2x minus 6 plus 4. So 2x minus 2 over x minus 1. And then we can continue to factor this numerator. So that all adds up or subtracts up to 2. So that negative, moving the negative from the numerator to the denominator, is going to be useful when we get into problems like this. So for this particular problem, these are uncommon denominators. But we're going to be using our knowledge of factoring out a negative 1 and shifting that negative to the numerator to help us add.